He was also known for other things. Actually, all Quakers were known for ranting against other ministers. Quakers would, and Fox would do this himself, would go into a Church of England. The service gets underway. Quakers would stand up and start ranting against the minister, saying this is an ungodly assembly, and just disrupt the whole thing. Oliver Cromwell had to pass a proclamation outlawing all these Quakers ranting in other people's churches. Again, 60 years later, Benjamin Lay does the same thing in Philadelphia. He goes from church to church. He wants to hear what the ministers are saying. And at some point, he's going to stand up and tell them exactly what he thinks. And folks, this did not always go well for him, because on one occasion, a minister was ready and had a bullwhip under the pulpit and literally chased Benjamin from the church with the bullwhip. But anyway, my point here is that Benjamin channeled this older, very radical kind of Quakerism, and one of the puzzles for me was to figure out exactly how that happened. Part of it was his very great interest in history. He had the best library in all of Pennsylvania of the early Quaker thinkers and theologians. He studied Quakerism. He knew about this earlier, more radical kind of outlook. And it was also true that there was a kind of heretical underground of radical Quakerism in the region where Benjamin grew up. I was able to link this to the persistence of a certain kind of radical Quakerism there. And this then leads me to one of the conclusions of the book, which is that even though the English Revolution ended in 1660, and Benjamin Lay is not born until 1682, he is in many ways the last radical of the English Revolution. He carries a set of ideas forward into the 18th century and links them to abolitionism. Some of the ideas of the most radical Quaker founders. So that's the core of Benjamin Lay's belief. A second very important part of this is his experience as a sailor. Now, I should have mentioned, but let me mention now, that there are occasionally great moments in research when you kind of can't believe what you found. Well, I was able to find a copy of a book that was in Benjamin Lay's personal library. Now, he had a library in his cave of about 200 volumes, which is a very big library for the 18th century. And at the Germantown Historical Society, there is a book written by a man named William Dell, who it turns out is one of the most radical preachers of the English Revolution. And you open up that book, and it says in a bold hand, "This book belongs to Benjamin Lay." So here's a thinker of the English Revolution, and here's Benjamin Lay, who owns the book, and it turns out it's full of marginalia. So it's like a dialogue between a 17th century radical and an 18th century radical. And this is actually a passage, this is Benjamin's writing down here, but this is a passage in which William Dell is talking about how people who are going to found the true church, William Dell is what is called a seeker. There are all these radical groups in the English Revolution, levelers, diggers, seekers, ranters, and Quakers. He was a seeker, and he mentions at some point in his text that he was a weak vessel for carrying God's word. He says, he uses the phrase, "I'm a bruised reed." Now, William Dale was a very learned man. He was a professor at Cambridge. But notice what Benjamin Lay says. If so great a man, William Dell, called himself a bruised reed, which was, meaning William Dell, master of a college in the University of Cambridge, then Lay asks in his humility, what may I call myself that was a poor common sailor and no more? Now, Benjamin believed in humility, even if he did not always practice it. because he had great faith in his own ideas. And in his book, he talks about how people jokingly called him Little Benjamin, but then he reminds you that little David slew Goliath. And he's going to slay the Goliath of slavery. So here's an example of that continuity out of the English Revolution. Okay, and then, notice this clever transition, a poor common sailor. Right? When Benjamin wrote these words, he probably had not been to sea for 20 years. But this was his identity. He was a common sailor. And this was a very important part of his authority as a writer, because sailors were the most cosmopolitan people of their day. They had been around the world. They had seen everything. And so when Benjamin would issue these judgments about slavery, he would say, I have seen mankind in all nations, all colors, and all countries of the world. And I know. So you better believe me when I say it. But that's not all he got from seafaring. He also, there for the first time, heard stories about slavery, sailors' yarns. He talked to sailors who had been in the African slave trade. He was horrified to hear tales of violence against women. And he got one more thing from the seafaring: an ethic of solidarity. Because seafaring is a really dangerous line of work in the era of the wooden ship. These sailors put their lives in each other's hands, and Benjamin learned to do that, but he had the capacity to extend that idea of solidarity to enslaved people. Empathy with the plight of people who worked hard for a living. So this kind of maritime radicalism, that's a second element in Benjamin's makeup. A third is basically his intimate knowledge of the struggles of Afro-Barbadian people. Someone used to say that the problem with the abolitionists is that none of them have ever actually seen or experienced the thing they denounced. Absolutely not true of Benjamin Lay. Because on the waterfront in Bridgetown, Barbados, he knew a lot of enslaved African people. He saw them starving to death in some instances. He saw them tortured. He saw them executed. There was a certain moment, an experience that Sarah had that he writes about very movingly in his book. Sarah was visiting Quaker friends outside Bridgetown, and she came to their house, and there's an enslaved man hanging by a chain with a puddle of blood beneath his body. And Sarah, who Benjamin called a tender-hearted person, was just so shaken. She just was stunned. And eventually she went inside the house to these Quakers and said, what is this? What is happening here? And they said, this man ran away from our plantation and he must be punished. So they saw this kind of torture, they saw death, Benjamin saw people's bodies get mangled in the machinery that produced sugar. And he and Sarah began to feed the hungry. They invited enslaved people into their home. Word got out. Hundreds of people showed up in this tiny little place where they lived. And of course the word got out to the master class. And Benjamin and Sarah began to be harassed. Because at these meetings they were also denouncing the source of everyone's misery, which was slavery. Eventually Benjamin and Sarah decided to leave. They felt that they must escape the horror of this place. They went back to London. They went to Colchester. And when they came to Philadelphia in 1732, Benjamin saw that slavery was practiced in the city of brotherly love. Now, nothing like Barbados, where 8 out of every 10 were enslaved. There was only about 1 in 10 in Philadelphia, but slavery was a very significant part of the early economy of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And of course, as we've said, a lot of Quakers owned slaves. Benjamin was furious about this. He was furious. He was so hopeful about Pennsylvania and so devastated that slavery was part of the reality. So that's the third element in his breakthrough. So we've got radical Quakerism, maritime radicalism, and really the struggles of people of African descent on the plantation. The fourth element, and here we'll go back to the painting. Benjamin became a commoner in a literal sense, meaning he decided that he wanted to get out of the market economy. He wanted to escape the world of money. He believed that the love of money was the root of all evil. So his way of doing this was basically to translate his egalitarian principles into his lifestyle. Of course, he embraced the Quaker plain style, but he carried it to an extreme. He made all of his own food. You'll see in the foreground, you have a melon, squash, pears, apples, and just to the right there, Benjamin's favorite food, turnips. He was a vegetarian, well ahead of his time. This is because he believed that animals were our fellow creatures and that we should not kill them. Now, this is actually a very ancient idea. He had read Pythagoras, who had said that